Good morning. Welcome, everybody, to Office Hours, Strongtown's opportunity for our members to be able to gather together, talk through various issues from a Strongtown's perspective, and to consider the topics that are so core to building sustainable, resilient, and long-lasting communities. With us today is Geoffrey Donovan of the U.S. Forest Service. I'm especially grateful that Jake, one of our Strongtown's members, suggested that we connect with Geoffrey and hear his perspective on the role of street trees and the roles of tree canopies and forests within our communities, and what it takes for us to really value and treasure these amazing assets that we have that have sadly often been ripped up because they got in the way of a pipeline or of pipes or infrastructure, often are neglected, often are abused, and yet in many cases, if we just show them a little bit of love, actually return so much value to our communities. I love the declaration that a street tree in particular, is the only type of public infrastructure that increases in value and strength as it ages. Unlike our pipes, unlike our roadways, unlike our city centers, unlike all of the other things that we invest our money into, the hard surfaces that we keep up and yet struggle to maintain, trees bring so many other alternatives for us as we continue to see opportunities for investment in them. And so with that, Geoffrey works for the Forest Service. He's out in Portland, Oregon, has published widely on this, particularly on quantifying the benefits of urban trees and identifying ways that the aspects of tree contributions to our communities through summertime cooling, through health benefits, through increases in property values, public health outcomes, all of those things, in addition to what must have been a previous life, also focus on the economics of wildfire management. And so with that, Geoffrey, what is an urban forester and who becomes an urban forester? And just take that wherever you want as an introduction.
Sure. Well, I think if you think of urban forestry compared to more traditional forestry, how does that differ? Well, obviously just the location, you're in towns, but the other thing here would be scale. An urban forester may spend considerable effort on maintaining or saving an individual tree. Clearly, that's not going to happen out in the woods. It's just not practical. And why is that? It gets to the second one. The values are just so much higher. On a per tree basis, urban trees are orders of magnitude more valuable than wildland trees. Wildland trees are extraordinarily important, to be clear, but on a per tree basis, urban trees are far more important. And why is that? It's just the proximity with the people. That's when they rub up against the people, they provide this wide range of benefits, and that's why. And so the other thing, hang on a second there, I'm just looking at that. One thing to also mention is that they are typically managed with the express purpose of providing values to people. That's typically what urban forestry is trying to do. Whereas wildland forestry, you may have more general ecological concerns. That's generally not the case for urban trees. We're just they're little value providers for people, and we're trying to maximize that. And I got into it accidentally. As Norm said, I was working in wildfire, and I'd done a study of the effect of wildfire risk on house prices. And somebody suggested, hey, why don't you look at the effect of trees when you look at the effect of trees on house prices? And so I did, and it was an interesting study, and it found quite a high impact. And at first I was very pleased with myself. We got these big numbers, isn't that great? But then it started to feel a little like a millstone around my neck, because I realized, well, if trees add this much value to homes, there has to be a reason why. Why do they do that? And I should be able to decompose that value. And it became tricky to do. So I started to look at some of the more obvious values. So things like carbon sequestration, energy consumption, and there's some value there. But it wasn't until I got into the less intuitive benefits where I found values that could really account for this big impact. The impact of trees on crime, for example, and the big one, I believe, is the impact of trees on public health. That's the big value. That's where I think, to some degree, some of the biophysical values become rounding error compared to the public health benefits. So that's kind of how I got into urban forestry, just by accident.
Do you want to touch on the impact or the relationship between trees and crime? Because that is an area I don't think that we've covered on our site. We've tried to touch on, cleaner air, cleaner water, all of even the capacity to double as storm sewer sort of infrastructure. But what about on crime? That's a fascinating angle of this.
Yeah, and the biophysical ones, the intuitive ones are important, but the weirder ones tend to be more important, I think. But the problem with the weird ones is people don't understand them. And there's this old adage in economics, if you can't count it, it doesn't count. And that's the problem you run into. So in 2001, in Chicago, there was a classic study Quo and Sullivan did, and they did it in the Ida B. Wells public housing development. And they're these sort of apartment buildings, and they found ones that had more trees outside because people were randomly assigned to these. It's public housing. They would randomly assign you to a particular building, and they found that there was lower crime in the buildings that had trees outside. And I was fascinated by that. So I decided to do a study in Portland because, maybe this is a function of this being in a very deprived area. Who knows? So I did a study in a more typical area, and I found an interesting thing. There was trees could go in both directions. So large mature trees that either were street trees or that were in a yard but weren't blocking views were associated with lower crime. Small view obstructing trees, say in front of a window, were actually associated with higher crime. And that's just a visibility issue. I mean, you see the same thing actually with wooden fences. You might think a view obstructing barrier around your house is good for crime. No, it's not, because it provides cover for criminals. The crime people always say the best barrier around your home is one of those metal fences, where you can see through it. So there's a privacy security trade-off there. But what we think with bigger trees, well, how on earth could they decrease crime? Some of you may be familiar, given this audience, with the broken windows hypothesis in criminology. We think trees are the opposite of a broken window, where a broken window sends a signal to a criminal that an area isn't well cared for, that if they were to commit a crime, the police wouldn't get called, they wouldn't get caught. What does a mature tree signal to a potential criminal? I think in this case, it's signaling that somewhere is well cared for, that you have effective surveillance, that you're more likely to get caught. So the answer there is trees do appear to be good for crime, reduction in crime, but you do got to be careful to not obstruct views. And then we actually did another study there where we looked at a follow-up study where we looked at the emerald ash borer. So we looked at this in, where was it? We're in Cincinnati now, I think. I may have got that wrong, somewhere in Ohio. And we found that as the emerald ash borer moved through the city in neighborhoods, as it lost more trees, we saw an increase in crime. So we use that natural experiment. So it does appear, yeah, that the natural environment can be an effective tool for lowering crime.
Well, the idea, I mean, we shape our environment, but then our environment shapes us, and that's
Yep.
really powerful. So that is fascinating, and we could take a long detour into that area. But I want to go to maybe the first part of your work was on wildfire risk and adaptation, impact mitigation, that sort of stuff, as well as the adaptation of building practices. What's going on that concerns you when it comes to development practices in our boundary areas or our transition zones from urban to wilderness areas? And where do you see, maybe as a second part, where do you see signs of hope that we're starting to get what it's going to take?
Well, I think there's two fundamental problems, I believe, with how I think of it as an issue of incentives and policy levers. So all the actors in, can I just call it the wildland urban interface, where we all know what that means. All the actors in the wildland urban interface, be it the land management agency, individual homeowners, insurance companies, or municipal governments, none of them, they all face a subset of incentives. So for example, if you're a municipal government and you're trying to set, should we have stricter building codes to require, that will impose a cost on homeowners, but they will make houses more fire safe? Should we do that? Well, in making those decisions, you don't have to consider the cost of wildfire suppression. That's the land management agency is going to bear that cost. You don't have to bear the cost of the loss of the houses. The insurance company or the homeowner is going to bear that. So you may make decisions that are entirely rational for you. It's not me suggesting it's wrong or inappropriate, but you're not considering a whole set of costs. So if you look at each of the actors, none of them face the true incentives. They're all looking at part of the elephant, And then you also have the limited access to policy levers. So what I mean by that, let's say in the US, you did the US Forest Service, and you're trying to what their state goal is to minimize the sum of wildfire damages and suppression costs. So just total costs, either damages or direct costs. So you're trying to minimize that. Now, what can you do to do that? Well, the only access you have is wildfire suppression or fuels management. Those are the policy levers you can pull. But it may be possible that it might be more cost effective, for example, to just make houses more fire resistant. That might be cheaper. I'm not saying it is, just it may be cheaper than just trying to suppress large, expensive wildfires. But you can't do that because you can't pull those particular policy levers. You can't affect how insurance companies set their rates. So again, there's no sort of overarching authority that has the proper incentives and access to all the policy levers. I think for hope really is it's getting so bad that I think people are starting to realize the scope of the problem and that some new approaches may be necessary. We're starting to realize that decades of aggressive wildfire suppression has a cost, and that's not really the way to go. We're also realizing that with the extreme fire behavior we have now, we can't even control them. There's not, it becomes a moot point. So I think there's more realization, say, in where I am in Oregon. If you look at central and eastern Oregon, you have winter, then spring, then smoke season. And that's what summer is now, is smoke season. So you're starting to realize that, and I think people may be more amenable to the sort of larger, more holistic policy approaches that are going to be necessary.
Well, and that brings me to the next question, which is that there were traditional patterns of fire protection or damage mitigation that we need to relearn. And in British Columbia, our forest services and fighting services really are still struggling to learn from First Nations communities how to work effectively with them. And oftentimes the things that should have been done sort of in the early stages of a season to address wildfires are not being done. And the consequences is that the conventional approach is just failing us, and we need to relearn those things. Do you want to touch on that? And maybe for the work of, like, we've got some city council members or planning commissioners and others that what do they need to be investing in? And perhaps what are some of the things that need to stop?
Well, I think the notion that fire suppression is the way through this, we're starting to realize that's not really going to work. It's like, remember decades ago when we had towns and they would build flood barriers to stop rivers going out into floodplains. And sometimes they could be effective, but what happened to the community downriver? The water again made floods worse. So we started to understand that if you control floods in one area, you shift it spatially, and that we need to actually keep floodplains open. That's a temporal equivalent with wildfire. You suppress it now, you're making the problem worse in the future. And as you said, some of the First Nations or Native Americans did use fuels management. So we're starting to understand the value of that. But I think even that may not solve the problem because it got so big. We just haven't got the budgets to do the fuels management necessary. What you have to do is treat, I think my belief is that the way to do this is lowering suppression and using wildfires as fuels treatment, So you're going to have to allow them we can consider switching from putting the fires out to allowing them to burn where possible. I think that people are seeing those as a more effective policy. So I really think that's an issue. And then the other thing more broadly, and this is where the local municipal government could come in, is we've approached fires as you put them out or you do treatment so that they're less damaging. But maybe what we need to think about, one other option, is to harden the resources at risk. So make those fires more resilient, make those houses more resilient, maybe don't build them in certain places. So I think that's where the municipal and local government can very much come in, is deciding they decide what values get put in harm's way and how at risk those values are. And that makes such an enormous impact, because if you think about it, if you think of first principles, wildfires don't do any damage. If a wildfire just burns it in a wilderness, does it fundamentally do any damage? Can a fire-adapted landscape be damaged by fire? It's somewhat of a philosophical question. My thought is no, probably. What the damage comes from the stuff we put in the way. And so thinking more carefully about what stuff we put in the way and how we keep that stuff in the way safe, I think focusing more on that may be the way forward. Just realizing that large wildfires are here to stay. We're not putting them out, and we're probably fuels treatment can be somewhat effective, but that isn't going to get us out of the problem either, I suspect.
Well, and it does touch on how efficient our land use patterns are
Mhm.
and the level of protection that we feel that we should provide. And there's a public sort of moral claim that all homes need to be protected.
Mhm.
And yet you go back to the more of the frontier communities that would say, hey, I'm on my own. And there were, individuals that would stay in their properties and do battle against the flames and sort of maintain that. But the difference when it's entire neighborhoods, and yet those neighborhoods, from a strong town's perspective, we would say oftentimes because they're built in a suburban style, they
Mhm.
have not adapted. And because there's no ongoing adaptation of any of the communities by starting to add more two-story structures, three-story
Mhm.
structures,
Mhm.
changing up the building materials as part of the natural evolution of a neighborhood, you get these things that are as they were when they were first built in their most
Mhm.
fragile state.
Mhm.
And that creates the great risk. But what if we come into our more urban areas and into
Mhm.
the next stage of your career? What role do urban trees have in creating safe and livable and inviting places, in addition to some of the benefits that you've touched on?
What don't they do?
Right.
I mean, we could
Yeah.
we could have that discussion. It's really staggering when you think about it. So I think some of you are already aware of those biophysical benefits. So carbon sequestration effects on stormwater, reduced summertime cooling cost. Obviously, as climate gets worse, that's going to be a greater issue. But again, they can affect crime. They can affect things such as community cohesion. For example, I did a study rather, where we followed a tree planting program for 30 years, planted 50,000 trees in Portland. And we found that neighborhoods that planted more trees had they voted more often, which is a measure of civic engagement. But the big one is health, in all, physical, mental health from, well, not even from birth, from before birth. For example, I found that mothers with more trees around their homes are less likely to have underweight babies. So, even before they're born, trees are important. We know in the first couple of years of life, immune development matters. If you have more diverse trees and plants, kids are less likely to get asthma, even childhood leukemia. They then do better at school if they're greener, and then you go on towards, they're less likely to get ADHD. So it goes on, and then they also extend life. We see reduced rates of mortality in neighborhoods that plant more trees. And a study I did recently in Portland, we looked at the cost benefits of tree planting just for reduced mortality effects. And we found a benefit cost ratio of 1,727 to 1. So trees are cheap, life is expensive, healthcare is expensive. So these are things to consider. Sometimes you hear this notion that trees make a city more livable. Certainly, they do, but that's nowhere near going far enough. What I would contend is trees make a city survivable, and that's more fundamental. That we're not meant to live in grey boxes, and that urban trees are a highly cost-effective way of making cities survivable.
Oh, this is awesome. My parents moved onto a dairy farm in southern Alberta. The winds just blow, blow, blow. And you look at all of the homesteads and they all have big tree belts. And that was one
Mhm.
of my summer, tasks as a kid, was always making sure that what we were doing was planting little sticks. And yet we knew it would make our home more survivable and
Mhm.
actually allow us to sort of endure in these places. Think of the role of shade within our
Mhm.
public spaces and how critical that is for many people, especially those that are outside of their vehicles. And the
Mhm.
consequence of removing the trees is that many people feel like their vehicle is their space shuttle that takes them from one conditioned space where there's, quote
Mhm.
unquote oxygen, or, where you can live. And then you have to get in a vehicle and move to the other place where you can live. And a tree actually allows you to be like, oh, I could do a spacewalk with no additional, elements. But in my neighborhood, so I am growing a coffin tree. My neighbor or a friend of mine told me what a coffin tree was, which he limbs all the way or trims all the way up to about 8 feet. And then he said, now I'm just letting that tree grow. And by the time that I die, I can cut it down, chop it into boards, and they'll make a great coffin. So that's his coffin tree.
Okay.
My neighbor, on the other hand, heard me tell the story, was not amused because he said, it's going to make a mess of your pipes. What should we think about this? We've got an elaborate system of whisking water away from our homes and moving it around in our system. And the idea is, among an engineering class, that things work best when there are few trees to mess things up. Why is this a big error? I see you shaking your head already.
Mm.
And how can people who care about pipes and perimeter drains and sidewalks be convinced to love trees?
Yeah, the engineers are not the biggest tree lovers. Also, the same with power lines. Every time you have an ice storm and the trees go on the power lines, they talk about getting rid of them. Now, can trees affect pipes? Certainly, older pipes. Could tree roots affect them? Yep. But a little care about where you put trees when you pick an appropriate species. Not all trees have root patterns that are the same. But the two big things that can happen here, is the green infrastructure really is a great complement to the gray infrastructure. It's in no way, it's not competing with it. So, for example, trees can just reduce the amount of water that ends up in the system. It just never makes it in. So what does that do? It reduces treatment costs on a sort of per gallon basis. But it also means, with sewer systems, the big problem is getting maxed out. If the sewer pipes get maxed out, you're going to get back up into your house, no fun at all, or you're going to get overflow into the river, no fun at all. These things are to be avoided. So just reducing the total amount does that. But the other thing that trees can do, and also specific green infrastructure like bioswales, is it doesn't necessarily reduce the total amount, but it just slows it. So it moves into the system more slowly. Again, so you don't max out the system. And that's profoundly important because gray infrastructure is expensive. So we have some examples here in town where you have a neighborhood that there was a certain type of pipe that was put in a certain diameter, and then you get more development and it's really kind of undersized now. And so you have the potential for it to overflow. Now you can dig up the road and put in a bigger pipe, and in some situations that might be the case, but you may be able to use green infrastructure to slow the flow so that otherwise functional pipe, it's not falling apart, it's just too small, won't get maxed out. So no, green infrastructure is something to work with if you're an engineer. It's not something to shake your fist at.
Yeah, and the neighbor who was saying this, he said he had to spend, I think, $7,000 to dig up his perimeter drain because a tree had damaged it. I thought, but there has almost certainly been much greater benefit to you, far more than 7,000, but it's not a quantifiable benefit in the same way that the bill from the, excavator is. And there's also, living with trees versus living against them. And I think there's something really critical in that. But you've written about urban trees and housing costs and gentrification or displacement and some of those consequences. And it actually touches on what Adam has asked in the chat, where he said, rich areas around the world have older, larger trees. I'm not certain that actually I agree.
Sorry, I just saw something here. It said how it would. Somebody asked about sewer flow being slowed.
Okay.
I just want to say that I'm not
great.
sorry. I wasn't saying it would slow the flow within the pipe.
Right.
It would slow the water getting into it. So
Right.
it would just, you have 1,000 gallons of water, rather than it going in 5 minutes, it might go in 10 minutes. So no, it doesn't. Sorry if I was unclear. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, no, that's great. So Adam was asking, are trees the cause of improvements to living standards, or are large trees simply found in rich areas and wealth is behind the improvements in quality of life? And as you've written about urban trees and housing costs, maybe this is really connected. We're passionate about both trees, housing costs, the impacts on populations, but we don't always connect them. So how are they connected? And in what ways does it matter for the overlapping issues that we face in our community?
But these are all really good questions. So I'll start with the housing one. And I definitely want to get to the question about whether this is a bidirectional effect, because that's excellent. And it's something I want to address carefully. So yeah, the impact on housing prices, we do see that. We do see in both in house prices and rental. So people are willing to pay a premium to both buy a home and rent a home with a tree outside it. Now, one of the interesting things to look at there as well is anything that increases the sales price of homes will necessarily increase the property tax revenues. It's just goes with it. And in Portland, what we found is that that premium, the sort of amount that trees add to property tax revenues, was about triple the annual maintenance costs of trees. So they were literally self-financing. I don't mean in a like, oh, they provide these weird benefits that we can't count. And if you add those up, I mean, in a budgetary sense, you put X dollars in tree planting and maintenance, and you get 3X dollars back in terms of a bump in property tax revenues. So there's probably not too many things in municipal budgets that are self-financing. So one thing to consider. Now the issue of what I call the nice tree, nice neighborhood effect. Where are most trees in a city? If you look at an aerial photograph, you can pick out the wealthy neighborhood. It's going to be the greener one, right? They're going to be wealthier, whiter, and better educated. And we absolutely know race, education, income are drivers of health outcomes and other things too. So how do we get around that? Well, there's a couple of ways that I've tried to do. One, in your statistical models, you account for this. You try and take account of all these demographics, and that's a reasonable way of doing it, but it's not foolproof. So I took a couple of other approaches, sort of unique approaches. One, I looked at the spread of the emerald ash borer. It's interesting. It's this natural experiment. It's spread out from Detroit in 2002. It's going across the country, and it's spreading in a way that's independent of these demographic drivers. While at one point in time, trees might be associated with race, education, income, their loss of trees over time is not in this case. So this is this unique pattern of tree loss that allows you to essentially sideline those demographic considerations. And we found in this case that as the tree spread to a county, we saw increases in cardiovascular and lower respiratory mortality. We also did a study in Portland where we looked at tree planting by a non-profit, and they were specifically planting in underserved communities. It was the opposite. So they were planting throughout the city, but also in underserved communities. So that increment of trees going up wasn't related to race, education, or income, or if it was in the reverse. That is, we were getting more trees. For example, we had more African Americans in the community, they were getting more trees. And we found that those trees were associated with, what do we see? Well, the voter turnout, we found they had an impact on health. And we also looked at gentrification. So for those cases, it doesn't look like it's the race, education, or income. They certainly do something, but there appears to be a unique additional contribution of trees. Appears, to be clear, these are still associations. But the gentrification is a tricky one, because we know certainly green gentrification is an issue. We know in cities that have put large parks in, there's often these rails to trails projects. There's one in Atlanta, one in Chicago, the High Line in New York, and you see these quite substantial increases in house price, and there can be gentrification following that. So I went to look at whether tree planting could influence gentrification, and the answer is statistically yes. We did see some impact on gentrification because increase in house price are really the mechanism. That's how gentrification happens. Why are people forced out of a neighborhood? Because the house prices or the rental prices go up. And we did find that it took 6 years to pick up an effect after planting, and we did see a slight increasing effect, but it was pretty modest. I can give you the details in the paper. And what I would say there is absolutely, uncategorically, do not stop tree planting because of worries about gentrification. Because what you're then doing is in those underserved communities, you are keeping those tree values from them because you're worried about gentrification, which we found is quite modest. And interestingly, the year after we did the study was a study in New York and looked at their Million Tree Initiative. And they found the same thing, very modest impacts of gentrification. And this guy wrote a paragraph in his paper, which was all, I'm not saying he wrote it almost the same as me, the same conclusions, really passionately saying, yes, there is a modest effect. Don't keep those values from those underserved communities. So yeah, I mean, if you had really big tree planting projects, if they were accompanied by adding parks and things like that, those big changes, then green gentrification is an issue. But sort of typical tree planting projects in cities, it doesn't appear to be the prime a big thing to worry about.
Yeah, in much the same way that even, the inclusion of a library in a community center should not be something that you remove from a community to prevent displacement and gentrification, but instead just find ways to build strong, healthier, stronger communities and maybe address things like rent protections or other
Yep.
features rather than removing the things that make things more accessible.
And
Um,
sorry,
yeah,
just to be clear,
yeah,
if you want to stop gentrification, which is a legitimate public policy thing, approach it directly,
yeah,
right? It,
yes,
not planting trees is a terrible anti-gentrification
yeah,
policy. It's not going to work very well at all, and it's going to deprive people of those benefits. So by all means, deal with gentrification, but deal with it like any other policy issue, deal with it head on.
yeah. And it feels like it almost has a perverse sort of ring to it. The idea that, well, let's just remove anything which might potentially raise property values. But then what is that pathway or that opportunity
Mhm.
for building prosperity for those that are in a neighborhood already and existing in that place? When the question of like tenure of house or tenure of dwelling is far more significant. If you're a renter, you're going to face different pressures than if you're the homeowner as you go. But what about in the context of helping places to have a healthy urban forest?
Mhm.
And maybe do you want to touch on first, why did so many trees come down in many of our existing neighborhoods? What is there a policy failure? Or I mean, some of it is disease and not the lack of replacement dollars. But also it feels very conscious that a lot of our suburban neighborhoods lack trees. And then in that setting, how do we address this? Because in my city, our urban forester has issued a report saying that they've run out of places to plant trees.
Mhm.
We have an urban canopy that is quite shrunk compared to what it should be, and yet there's no more places to plant in school grounds, at the backside of parks, and it feels like they are ignoring the role of street trees and trees that are adjacent to the roadways. And in Blair, Nebraska, Jake had shared, who's on the call with us, that a tree can be planted 10 feet from the curb plus 6 feet from the sidewalk, which renders it virtually impossible to actually put a tree in that space. So if we think specifically between the curb and the sidewalk, how does that zone, I think, play a critical role in improving pedestrian facilities as well as improving the tree canopy?
I mean, suburbia, the place where you cut down trees and then name streets after them.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Yeah. So some excellent points there. One of the I think that parking strip. So we all know what I mean by the parking strip, right? Is such a wonderful place, and it's really important to have. But developers don't like big parking strips, right? And so sometimes, like I go around new neighborhoods here in Oregon, and you have a parking strip that is this big, literally like 18 inches. Now, does currently that neighborhood doesn't, nor can it look like some of the older neighborhoods in town where you have closed tree canopy in the middle of the street. But because of how you set it up, it can never look like that. It will never do that. And that's really sad. So I think, again, municipal ordinances here, as you said, where can you put the tree? And if you really limit that, it's not going to happen. But more fundamentally, you talked about this when somebody got the $7,000 bill, right? For the when you plant a tree, it becomes the costs become 100% it's a liability for you, right? But trees have all these spillover benefits. They benefit your neighborhood, they benefit your entire city. When it comes to carbon sequestration, they benefit the whole world. So you only see a small increment of those benefits, right? So the problem then is if you leave tree provision to individuals, you'll get too few trees from a societal point of view because they have 100% of the costs and a small fraction of the benefits. I sometimes talk about, like, if somebody said your favorite six pack of beer was on sale for $10, and you're like, great, you go down to the liquor store, you buy it, and you walk to your house, and then just as you're about to get in, your neighbors come and take five of those beers, and now it's like, I don't want to pay $10 for one. This is ridiculous. So you don't buy the six pack. Yeah, it's still worth it because your neighbors do get it. So you need to come up with ways of internalizing those benefits. So treating trees as community assets. So either by providing tax breaks to the people who plant them and maintain them, or just taking on the maintenance costs. I think street trees, some cities, Portland, for example, here, if it's the responsibility of an adjacent homeowner, I'm not saying what should or shouldn't happen. It's not my job. But I will say that if you do that, you will get underinvestment in trees. You will get a city which is not as green as the societal optimum. So maybe taking on the maintenance of those trees and the planting of those trees is one specific thing a city can do that can, and then, because big trees can be expensive, but the big trees, we often talk about tree planting. We got to get trees in the ground. We do, but the more I've done work, I realized that as trees get bigger, their benefits don't just go up linearly. The big trees are where the value's at. And so, but the big trees where the costs are at too. Yeah. So, if a big tree is in somebody's yard, maybe a tax break. If a big tree is in the street, then maybe the city can take on the costs. It's not a trivial thing, but it is something you can do.
And to extend the lifespan of a tree from 40 years to 60 years, depending on its species, could be the most consequential sort of thing that you can do. And maybe this is my last question that I'd prepared, but in order to keep, I've got an old Toyota Corolla with, for almost 300,000 miles on it. And I know that I need to do an oil change on it regularly in order to keep it going. And if I don't do that, of course, I'm not going to get a good outcome. But what about for trees? And I want to personalize this for everybody that's watching this is, what are the things that we can do as a resident of our community to improve conditions for trees? How do we add tree care to the list of things that we do as strong citizens? And maybe even provocatively, what could we do this afternoon?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, one of the amazing things about trees, and this is important from a policy perspective, and it gets missed, is that trees are a easily modifiable part of our environment. That's really important. So, for example, if we looked at the impact of various things on public health, trees may have an effect on public health. You could say poverty or income inequality has an effect on public health. Good luck doing something about that today. I'm not saying you shouldn't as a long-term project, but it's very difficult to address some of these fundamental, drivers of ill health. But trees, you can put it in the ground today, and that's very important. This is something that can be done, and that gets overlooked. I think, also if you do have a large tree in your yard and you take on the costs, there's very little you can do to be as good a neighbor as that. That's a profound thing you can do for your neighborhood. When you have a big tree, it can be an anchor for a neighborhood. Think of the places, where you walk a dog or something and you see those big trees. I often will, in a talk, say to people, close your eyes and imagine losing a large tree as a kid. And most people can remember that. I remember a large sycamore, and it was like there was a hole in the sky suddenly. This is really bad. I sometimes read a poem by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. He talks about the loss of a chestnut tree as a metaphor for the death of his mother. Very moving. And so I think if you can, take on those maintenance costs of a big tree, you really are being a profoundly good citizen. If you can't plant a tree where you live for various reasons, an apartment, get involved with some of those tree planting nonprofits. Normally, most cities have one. Even if they don't, I bet if you called up an urban forester in your town, I bet he'd be delighted to hear from you. There's all sorts of things you can do. So again, modifiable. These are things we can do now. And we can do, again, we've got way past the point where there's is a meaningful exercise to compare the costs and benefits of trees in urban areas. We're done with that now. We're done. The benefits, unless you do something very strange, like you plant a really big tree 18 inches from a historic house with bad foundations, if you don't do anything dumb, the benefits of trees are going to exceed the cost by orders of magnitude. So it just, so from a policy perspective, don't have any analysis paralysis. Get them in the ground. For the new ones, spend the money to maintain that existing tree canopy. It's going to be money well spent.
So not only do we need to hug our mothers, but also hug trees, and in the deepest sense of, that deep appreciation for them. Richard, why don't you jump in out in Walla Walla, Washington?
Hey, hi.
hello.
Okay. Hi, Geoffrey. Yeah, I am the recipient of all the smoke he just referenced in terms of winter, spring smoke, because I am downwind. I'm on the Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, and we get whenever the Cascades start to burn. Oh my gosh!
Mm.
But I wanted to go back to your mention about trees slowing down water or stormwater or whatever, which is excellent, and that kind of, if you just talk about it, it sounds like it's more of an urban problem, so to speak. I'm in a rural area, and plenty of areas that are rural need just as much in associated ways, but you have to explain it differently, maybe. And my example, which is exactly in line with yours, it's just different. When we switched, I live on a windy hilltop, and I've planted 3 rings of trees since I moved in, and I just love watching them grow and what they've done for me as well to protect me. But they also, I now am raising birds, which is just amazing. And the trees sing in the wind. Okay, so when we switched to what used to be called no-till farming, now you refer to it as regenerative farming. Compared to my neighbors, who don't, you can look at it. We have almost zero water runoff in our hilly fields, which means we don't have ruts and we don't lose soil and all sorts of things. Plus, we now, because we retain everything as opposed to burn it, we don't burn, we don't bale and sell it, the straw at the end of the season, etc. We're also raising soil, which is amazing, the soil quality. Consequently, there is an analogy or whatever. It's the same thing of slowing the water down. This is what I was getting at, slowing the water down. There are all these different ways it can be done. And depending upon what area you're in, trying to get people to go, oh, now I get that, because it's another way of explaining things, same thing, but using a different language, so to speak. So I love the whole thing. Again, it's so simple, but yet it's complicated until you see it in holistic.
I want to just, well, first, you're right to point out that these values exist in rural areas as well. And my apology if I sort of slighted rural areas.
Oh, no.
No, but I also just want to pick 2 things out of what you said. I have about the bird song in the trees. We're now starting to understand that natural sound is good for our health. We've known that like loud sound, like traffic, chronic loud sound is bad for your health. We're just starting to pick up that natural sound can be good for your health. And I'm designing a study now to look at the effect of trees on natural sound, where we take recordings around the city. Another thing, you're talking being on a farm and about the biodiversity. What I didn't really touch on is diversity matters. The diversity of the tree canopy and the plants can affect our immune systems. And we know, for example, that farmers' kids much less likely to get immune diseases like asthma because they're around. You may be familiar with the hygiene hypothesis, this notion that if we're not exposed to if we don't have microbial exposure, our immune systems don't develop, we're more likely to get immune diseases. So yes, thank you for bringing up the biodiversity issue.
Other questions or comments?
I put enough comments in there we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam.
If somebody could read one out of the chat, maybe I could.
Yeah. He said just that we have a lot of poor management of forests as a consequence of, or the poor management of forests, clear cutting for several decades, all of these various things have increased wildfire severity with, as he says, no help from the climate, exterminating beavers, building in fire zones, eliminating large grazers and browsers. And perhaps this is the challenge, and it's reflected in your own work, is you've shifted from wildfires, sort of rural areas, wildlands, into more urban settings. How do we keep a focus on both? And is that just a matter of rallying enough people to this? And is there something that I know some of our communities, and I wish that Jean Schwensen was on the call because she's in Greenlee, Arizona, where they are in a much more remote setting. And so as a result, they are at that interface a lot more frequently. But how do we sort of cover off both sides of it? This, because even our small towns in rural areas, benefit from trees. That was, for us on the farmstead, was having those trees was the way that we established sort of our survival in that area and buffered us from a lot of winter storms and things. Do you have any kind of further reflections on that?
Yeah, I think, and you're absolutely right. And the previous question as well, just making sure that, yeah, rural areas get these benefits as well. Of course they do. And they get some in the same way that we do, but there are also issues of scale. So, for example, people talk sometimes about the carbon sequestration benefits of urban trees. That's overplayed. There's just, but the carbon sequestrations of large wildland forest, absolutely an issue. So I think, think in terms of the scale. It happens differently in different places, both because the scale is different and then just the proximity to people is different. So that means, wildland, also water, for example, large intact watersheds are going to make a huge difference to water quality coming in to the town. If you have, in Portland, we have the Bull Run watershed, you can't even get access to it. It's closed to the public. And so we spend much less on water treatment than other towns. So that matters on the way in. But then, urban trees are going to affect the likelihood that the sewers overflow into the river. So that has an effect there. So it's, I think, just thinking in terms of scale and how trees can do different things in different places.
And it really does feel like it's a work of community coalitions coming together to really address these things. And I just shared a link to Trees Please Winnipeg, which is a really effective advocacy group with, I think, a very clever name as well. And they had to go through several budget cycles before the urban forestry division was actually allocated more funding in order to enable them to do more projects, particularly replacing trees that were fallen because of the Dutch elm disease and then the ash borers as well. And Chuck he's shared a comment about community, and I can't remember the name of where it was, but the community leaders went to the local hydro authority or the electric utility, and they said, you've got large areas where you've got your big overline head power lines and things like that. We don't have place for a tree nursery right now. Can we plant them beneath your power infrastructure? And by the time that it gets high enough, they'll be long gone. And so at a fraction, pennies on the dollar, they were able to just like plant a ton of trees. And then because they were in a climate where there was the potential they would need some watering, but maybe not all the time, they actually just used their fire department to basically hose down the trees in the times when it was necessary for them to get watered. And so the result was the fire department got to use their equipment. The pumping systems would get tested every so often. And these trees would receive the soaking that they needed on the occasions when it was needed, rather than the big infrastructure that goes into drip lines and all of those types of things. It was really interesting. It was an adaptation at the local level. Hey, let's figure this out. And then the result was they had a massive surplus. And in comparison, Winnipeg, which there's this advocacy there, they don't own their own tree lot. And so the city is not doing the thing of just setting aside a bit of its own land to cultivate new crops that are so cheap to plant, very difficult to you can get them cheaply if you have 2 years, very expensively if you have only a week. And that's the challenge then, that our budgets get stretched so thin. And I know in Lethbridge, where I grew up, they have their own tree lot. And so they are able to they sell trees for $10 to the residents, and they're mature, trees that are ready for transplanting. And those are great initiatives. So I guess the question, what are some other, maybe, do you have any other examples of places where communities have clustered together either to use land that the electrical hydro utility is using or their own tree lots? What are some of the things in order to increase the supply and just make it easier for people to do those types of planting out front of their homes?
Well, I'm not familiar with a lot of those projects. Sound amazing, but ultimately what they're doing is reducing the cost, right? And again, if you go back to that community asset thing, you don't reduce the cost of the individual as much as possible, because they're going to have these benefits that are going to aid the whole community. So anything you can do to do that, I would give the trees away for free. I did some work with an electrical utility in Sacramento, and they gave trees away for free. I showed they paid for themselves, not just for the people, because in that case it's kind of similar to the stormwater issue. Peak demand in electricity is the problem. That's when it's very expensive. You know, when it's 6 p.m. on a hot summer's day, and you have to turn on a power plant that gets turned on once a month. Costs a lot of money. If you can shade houses during that time, you can reduce peak demand. So again, thinking in terms of, I mean, I would go further, not only the trees free, I would think in terms of providing tax incentives. You know, if you have a tree and you get money off, it's the economics are such that we shouldn't be talking about low cost. We should be talking about paying people to grow trees. So I think anything like that, where you just, the incentives are wonky. We need to fix the incentives. So either by making them public assets and paying for them ourselves, or providing really strong incentives for individuals, say, in their yard. Because some of these, a big part of the urban forestry is on, big part of the urban forest is in private property. So let's get the incentives right for those people.
Yeah, 100%. And just a quick comment too, that I actually, my personal approach is the backyard trees from a public perspective almost matter very little. And I mean, we should protect them, and there's focus on that, but it's those ones in the front. It's those ones at that public-private interface that are so critical. But over to you, Richard, and questions or comments?
Well, I started thinking about Geoffrey. I was in the travel business, so going to just taking people to show them displays, museums, whatever installations. I was just thinking, my God, every community in around could have I'll call it a visitor center, where the trees are growing so that people can interact with them right there, and there are people also to explain it very, very quickly. And the things that people could experience very quickly, it's like they're cooling on a hot day. I have areas in my yard where in 100-degree weather, it's actually, if you get down low, it's actually a little chilly. I mean, it's fascinating. And a lot of people don't understand this. So you could do interactive in your community, but if you add in what Norm just talked about, which is blowing my mind because I could see doing it locally, if you get the fire department, everybody loves, particularly kids, love it when the fire department's doing something. And the fire department loves to be able to be on display, PR. And so they could be doing interactive things too, but also watering it, for goodness sakes, and using city water. That'd be great. And there's just a whole rolling thing here where every community could do something so that even if you're not immediately affecting a blighted area with no trees, people could walk down, or they could go in their community and experience it right there. And then maybe they might, oh, we want that in front of, even if it's, you know, even if they could only afford a couple trees, and if the trees are free, hey, great. So you just give me a huge idea. Thank you.
Well, not at all. And I just want to pick up another thing you said. You go on a tangent and talk about you're in the travel business. One of the fun things I like in some cities, we have a program in Portland called the Heritage Tree Program. It's for particularly large or historically important trees. And tree nerds like me go and visit them. There's one I could turn my camera around and show it over there. There's a nice big pagoda tree. It's not that huge, but it's a nice one. And it's a heritage tree. Well, why is that? Well, because the owners of the house brought that back from Richard Nixon's inauguration in 1972. Oh. So that's the Richard Nixon tree. It is crooked, by the way. I can show you that. So, but that, you know, it's fun. You've got just big trees. They're huge. Trees that are weird, like this one. And, you know, I think it allows people, you know, walk around the neighborhood, just get to know what trees can do. So, I mean, I don't think people would travel from around the world to see the Richard Nixon tree, but they might walk around the neighborhood. And again, one of the health benefits of trees is encouraging outdoor recreation, encouraging exercise, right? So, yeah, there's a conversation that could go on for a very long time.
It certainly can. And we are at the top of the hour. Geoffrey, this has been fantastic. I think you've encouraged us all to go for a walk and take stock of what we have and maybe work towards improving the places that we're in, as well as helping more places to continue to do this work as well. I can take credit for having planted many thousand trees as a tree planter for 2 summers.
Nice.
But unfortunately, none of them have, I haven't gone back to visit them. So I need to go one day to see the fruits of my labor. But this has been very valuable. Great. Really appreciate your time on this. This is going to get posted over to YouTube, and I'm really excited to be able to share this out as a resource for everyone. As always, if you have further questions for those that are on the call, we can always bring Geoffrey back as well. And, well, I'm
you can share. No, you can absolutely. Yeah. Delighted. It's been a very, it's been inspiring conversation. Share my email, and then we'll have an email afterwards where I can give you access to all the papers, links.
Excellent. Yeah.
So if somebody wants to dig deeper.
That's great. Love that. Well, I hope you've all been engaged as much as I have. This has been fantastic. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.